Hello, and welcome to Topic 2, Lecture 2, Perspectives on Justice. In the last lecture, we summarized the first three criminal justice perspectives, and in this lecture, we're going to summarize the remaining three: the non-interventionist perspective, the equal justice perspective, and the restorative justice perspective. As I mentioned in the last lecture, you're going to be applying these concepts in this week's discussion, and you'll want to make sure that you read the textbook for more in-depth coverage of each of these perspectives. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's get started with perspective for the non-intervention perspective. The main focus of the non-intervention perspective is minimizing contact with the criminal justice system. And why is that? Why do they think that the least contact with the criminal justice system is the best kind of contact with the criminal justice system? Well, from their perspective, they argue that the ultimate effect of involvement with the criminal justice system is harmful. And in fact, the contact with the criminal justice system can oftentimes be more harmful than the offense itself. Well, why do they think that the contact with the criminal justice system is harmful? Well, from their perspective, they think that that contact with the criminal justice system often results in stigma and in labeling. And so that once even if once you're arrested, and let's say that even if you're not charged with a crime, right? There's a stigma that comes with that. You're the person who got arrested. You're up to no good, right? And so there's a stigma that comes with that. And even if you are arrested and charged and you plead guilty or are found guilty, then you're labeled, right? You're labeled as a felon, or you're labeled as a violent criminal, or you're labeled as a drug dealer, whatever it may be. Okay, and they think that this labeling and the stigma is harmful because it's something that follows you throughout your life, and that it's hard to move on from these labels once you're reintegrated back into society. That they also think that the criminal justice system is harmful because the contact with the criminal justice system, particularly if it results in incarceration, can be very disruptive to families, can be disruptive to parents of those who are incarcerated, or children of the incarcerated, can be disruptive to the community. If vast majorities of your community members are behind bars or under some sort of court and correctional supervision, it has an impact on kind of a disintegrating impact on that community. And they also think that these labels and stigmas can have sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in the individual. Like if you're labeled as a criminal, if you're labeled as dangerous, if you're labeled as somebody who should be monitored and watched by the criminal justice system, a lot of times that the response to that can be frustration, right? And that when you feel like you've been labeled and you're trapped by that label, you might say, you know what? You think I'm a criminal? I'm going to act like a criminal, and so that kind of labeling actually results in more antisocial criminal behavior than it prevents. They also focus on the effects of institutionalization, right? That there's no better way, from their perspective, to create a criminal than to put a person behind bars, because you are behind bars with a lot of other people who are offenders, who are either involved in antisocial and criminal behavior or aren't, but are acting as if they are. And it's a great way to be sort of pulled out of normal society, brought into institutional society of incarceration, and to become sort of like identified as an offender. And so those are the reasons why the non-interventionist perspective views contact with the criminal justice system as harmful. Now, keep in mind the non-interventionist perspective doesn't think that there should be no criminal justice system. What they're basically saying is that the criminal justice system should be reserved for to focus on the most violent offenses within our society. and that for nonviolent offenses or so-called victimless crimes, and so victimless crimes could be seen, not everybody agrees with this, but a victimless crime could be seen as drug dealing, right? You're dealing drugs, an individual wants drugs, who's the victim there? Or prostitution, right? A prostitute is providing a service, somebody wants that service, where's the victim in that? And so they think that these nonviolent victimless crimes should really be it should be decriminalized, and that when it comes to punishments for nonviolent offenders, that there should be opportunities for a lot of alternatives to incarceration, because that's the effect of incarceration has a very damaging impact on the person and on society. Let's move on to perspective 5, which is the equal justice perspective. The main focus for the equal justice perspective is ensuring that all people receive the same treatment under the law. From their perspective, the reason why people commit crimes, well, there's lots of reasons why people commit crimes, but they think that unequal justice results in certain things. So that if two people commit the same crime and one person gets a really long sentence and the other person just gets a slap on the wrist, that results in frustration and a lack of trust in the criminal justice system. And so if you're the recipient of a very harsh sentence, knowing that somebody who committed the same crime didn't get a harsh sentence at all, that could aid in recidivism or repeat offending. Well, you're sitting behind bars, you might think, you know what, I wasn't treated equally, and screw it. Like I got a really tough sentence. If when I get out, I'm gonna reoffend. Maybe I'll get a light sentence this time. Or maybe, I'm just going to be treated unjustly, so why should I follow the rules, right? And so, they really do think that, kind of similar to the due process perspective, that when we lack confidence in the criminal justice system to protect people's rights and to treat people equally, that lack of trust makes it more difficult for people to actually abide by the social contract, to follow the rules. And as it says there, that lack of trust as well. So the equal justice perspective places emphasis on a few things. One thing they place emphasis on is equal treatment. And so that an offender, it shouldn't matter what their class is, their economic class. It shouldn't matter how much money they have, whether they're rich, poor, middle class. It shouldn't matter what their race is. It shouldn't matter what their gender or age is. But that what should matter is their offense, and that people who commit offenses should be treated equally. So you're judged by your offense, not by by your race or your gender, your age, or your class. Your textbook talks about this thing called the racial animus model. And that relates to, and this is a concern that the equal justice perspective has as it relates to race. They basically say that in America, and if you've ever read The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Time of Colorblindness, in that book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander references a study where they asked people to close their eyes and imagine what a criminal looks like, right? And they close their eyes and they say, well, when I think of a criminal, what I think of is a young African American male who commits offenses with little to no remorse, right? And so that's what the racial animus model is. It's sort of like, it's this perspective that Americans think that certain types of people, young African Americans, young people in general, poor people, that, they have a proclivity towards crime. And the racial animus model really focuses on this assumption that people of color, particularly young men of color, have a proclivity towards crime. And therefore, they need to be treated differently than others, right? They need to get harsher sentences, harsher treatment, more monitoring by law enforcement. And that really wrangles the equal justice perspective. They think that is fundamentally unjust. So for them, what they focus on is that don't focus on the characteristics of the offender, And in fact, that's unconstitutional. We'll be looking at that later in the semester. Although it's, as we're going to find out, it's hard to demonstrate or prove racial and other forms of discrimination within the criminal justice system. So what they focus on is that people who commit the same offense should get the same sentence, regardless of their other characteristics. So they support truth in sentencing. That is that a person is sentenced to X number of years, 10 years, and they serve the vast majority of their sentence, regardless of anything else. They also support mandatory minimum sentencing, right? So that you can't wiggle your way out of a sentence. Everybody gets a mandatory sentence for a particular offense. They also think that the punishment shouldn't be for past behavior or a perception of how this person will behave in the future, but that the punishment should be related to the present offense. Again, bringing us closer to equal treatment. And this brings us to the last perspective we're going to be learning about, perspective 6, the restorative justice perspective. So the main focus of the restorative justice perspective is creating a just and peaceful society. And when asked the question, why do they think people commit crimes? They say that there's many reasons for why people commit crimes. But one reason that people commit crimes is because they fail to really understand the harm that their offense, that their criminal act has caused. Other people have caused families, have the harm that it's caused to a community. And really, when you think about it in our criminal justice system, there aren't a lot of opportunities for the offender to really understand or be given the opportunity to confront the harm that they have caused. You know, when you think about it, when people are arrested and then charged with a crime, most often they are just unable to make bail, and then they're just whisked off to, a county jail, and they sit and wait as they prepare for trial or more likely to plead guilty to the charge. And so, the offense that they committed, they are kind of abstracted away from that because they're no longer in the community, but they're in this sort of isolated area of being in a correctional facility, a jail, and then ultimately a prison. And so from the restorative justice perspective, that they think that the key to not just reducing the amount of crime that takes place in the United States, but also preventing and fixing the harm that comes from crime, is to give offenders a reality check, to actually see what they did and how the harm that it has caused the victim, the victim's family, and the community at large. So from the restorative justice perspective, that they want the resolution of the conflict, right? The resolution of you committed a crime and your crime harmed somebody. They want that resolution not to take place in sort of an abstractly. They don't want a person to be sentenced punitively by the state and then corrected by the state, right? Because again, there's this gap between the harm you committed and the impact of your harm. But they think that the resolution of the conflict should actually take place in the community. And you're going to be reading about that in the article for this week, Can Forgiveness Play a Role in Criminal Justice? Restorative justice really believes in these opportunities for offenders to come together with victims, to hear the stories of victims, and then to have the opportunity to take personal responsibility for the harm that they caused and to make amends to the victim and to the families of the victims. So for them, the best way to prevent crime is that the offender is confronted by the victim. They actually see the harm that they caused by their crime. And then rather than just being like, okay, look at the damage that you did, that you actually give the offender an opportunity to repair the breach, right? To actually do whatever they can do to make amends to the family and to the community. And from this perspective, they think if offenders are given that opportunity to repair the harm, that they're more easily and effectively able to reintegrate into society. Because a lot of times that reintegration is hard to take place because you're always labeled as this irredeemable, right? This person who is always defined by their worst act. But when offenders are given that opportunity to confront and repair their harm, and then they can say, look, I did that. I contributed to repairing the harm. And that makes me worthy of re-entry into society. So from the restorative justice perspective, the punishment is linked to repairing the harm that has been caused. That can be, making amends, a financial compensation as possible, just listening to victims and mourning with them in terms of the grief that they and their family have experienced. And then giving offenders who actually have taken seriously the responsibility of their crime an opportunity to more quickly reintegrate back into society. So I think I mentioned this in the earlier lecture that sometimes the restorative justice perspective can seem sort of like kumbaya, let's all get together, and it's easy for offenders to understand the harm that they did. And that's not where the restorative justice perspective is coming from. They know that it is difficult. It's difficult for an offender to hear and actually make efforts and changes to repair the harm that they cause. They also know that it's very hard for victims to do that as well. But they really think that if you want to create a just and peaceful society, you've got to do the hard work of restorative justice to really bring about justice to the victims, and also to really not just say, well, you were punished, come back into society and you reoffend. But if you really want that violence to stop, that when offenders know what they did and the harm that they caused, it leads them back to actually becoming a more peaceful member of the society. Okay, so hopefully these two lectures have given you a better understanding of the 6 justice perspectives. And this lecture combined with the reading and the textbook and the article for this week, I think hopefully will give you the foundation that you need to robustly participate in this week's discussion. And so this week's discussion gives you an opportunity to apply the concepts, to apply these criminal justice perspectives. Now, this week you're going to be assigned a perspective. And so when you go to the online discussion, you'll see there's a link there and you'll find your name and that you will be given one of these 6 perspectives. And then you'll be asked to describe your assigned perspective. It may not be your perspective of choice, but you are asked to describe the perspective, similar to what we've done in these lectures, but bring in more stuff from the textbooks as well. And then you're going to sort of evaluate the perspective, ask, hey, what does this perspective get right? Where does it fall short? And then you are going to explain how 2 of the following agents within the criminal justice system, how would they do their job if they were governed by your perspective? So how would they do their job? So first, let me show you. So you'll say, you choose your own 2: police, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, correctional agents, whether that's probation or parole agent or like an actual person who works in a correctional facility. So you'll choose 2 of those, okay? And then you'll take your perspective and you'll say, okay, so if my perspective is the non-intervention perspective, how would police do their job if they were governed by the non-intervention perspective? How would prosecutors or judges do their job if they were governed by that perspective, okay? So it gives you an opportunity to make a connection between the perspectives we're learning about and then also the job, these different agents that we learned about in the criminal justice process, right? So it allows you to sort of bring these the 2 parts of the chapter together, okay? And then finally in the discussion, you get to choose any of the 6 perspectives. It doesn't have to be the one that's assigned to you. But then you get to make an argument for, of the 6 perspectives we learned about, which comes closest to your own perspective. You can pick one, you can pick two, there's not a requirement that you pick two, but a lot of times people have a hard time saying that one perspective comes closest. So if you need to pick one or more, have at. That's totally fine. All right. Thanks for paying attention. Super appreciate it. And I'll talk to you again next week.